Before I begin, if you've ever lived through betrayal like this, especially from the people you loved and sacrificed for, please like, leave a comment, and subscribe to my YouTube channel, because stories like mine are more common than we want to admit. I used to believe that if you gave your children everything you had, your time, your patience, your body, your youth, they would grow up understanding what love looked like. I believed love was a ledger that always balanced in the end. I believed wrong. My name is Evelyn, and for most of my life, being a mother wasn't just a role I played. It was the center of my identity, the axis everything else spun around. I raised my son, Daniel, mostly on my own after his father left when Daniel was 7. I don't tell that part with bitterness anymore. Back then, I was too busy surviving to sit in anger. I worked 2 jobs, sometimes 3, and I learned how to stretch a dollar until it begged for mercy. Daniel grew up watching me iron clothes at midnight and pack lunches before dawn. He grew up knowing I was tired, but he also grew up knowing I was there. Every school play, every parent-teacher meeting, every scraped knee and broken heart, my presence was the one constant I promised him. When Daniel met Lauren, I was cautious but hopeful. Mothers learn to read the air around their children. You notice the way their voices change, the way they stand a little straighter, the way they start protecting their phones like secrets. Lauren was beautiful in a soft, polished way. She spoke gently but with confidence, and she looked at Daniel like he was something precious she had finally found. I wanted to believe that was real. The first time I met her, I cooked too much food, like I always did when I was nervous. She complimented the roast, asked about my work, and laughed at Daniel's childhood stories with just enough restraint to not embarrass him. I remember thinking, maybe this will be easy. Maybe this will be one of those rare blessings. When they announced their engagement, Daniel came to my apartment with a bottle of cheap champagne and a grin so wide it made his cheeks ache. He hugged me longer than usual, and for a moment I felt like I had my little boy back in my arms. He told me they wanted a small but beautiful wedding, something elegant but not over the top. I asked the question before he could even finish his sentence. I told him I would help pay. Not because he asked, because that's what mothers like me do. We step forward before anyone can say we didn't. I had been saving for years, not for myself. I stopped planning for myself a long time ago, but for moments like this. I had a modest retirement fund and a separate savings account I called Daniel's Future, even though he was already grown. When I told him I could cover the venue and catering, his eyes filled up. He said, "Mom, you don't have to." I said, "I know, but I want to." Lauren thanked me too. She hugged me, and I felt her shoulders relax against mine. In that moment, I thought we were becoming family in the truest sense of the word. The months that followed were busy and loud and filled with decisions, flowers, seating charts, menu tastings. I went with Lauren to bridal appointments when her own mother couldn't get time off work. I listened to her worries about fitting in with Daniel's friends, about being good enough, about whether marriage would change him. I reassured her the way I always reassured Daniel, by listening first, then speaking carefully. I paid deposits without flinching. I signed checks that took years of savings with them, and I told myself it was worth it. This was my son's happiness. This was the closing of one chapter and the beginning of another. Somewhere along the way, the tone shifted. It was subtle at first. Lauren stopped calling as often. Decisions were made before I heard about them. The guest list changed, but no one explained how or why. When I asked questions, Daniel would say things like, "It's just wedding stress, Mom," or "Lauren's family has a lot of opinions." I didn't want to be the difficult mother-in-law. I had seen enough stories to know how easily that label sticks. So I swallowed my concerns and smiled through them. 3 days before the wedding, I was folding laundry when my phone buzzed. It was a message from Daniel. Short, too short. He asked if we could talk later. My stomach tightened in that familiar way it used to when he was a teenager and got into trouble at school. I told him I was free any time. He didn't reply for hours. When he finally called, his voice was careful, like every word was being weighed before it left his mouth. He said, "Mom, there's been a change." I waited for him to say the venue had an issue or someone got sick or the weather forecast turned ugly. Instead, he said, "Lauren and I think it's best if you don't come to the ceremony." I remember the room tilting like the floor had shifted under me. I asked him to repeat himself because my brain refused to accept the words the first time. He sighed, a long, tired sound, and said it again. He told me they still appreciated everything I'd done. He said this wasn't about money. He said it was about peace. I asked him what that meant. There was a pause on the line, and then he said, "I just want everyone to be happy." After the call ended, I sat on the edge of my bed and stared at my hands. These were the same hands that had rocked him to sleep, wiped his tears, signed his permission slips, paid for his dreams, and now they were empty. The wedding I had funded, planned, and prayed over would happen without me. I wasn't just uninvited, I was erased. That night, I didn't cry the way I thought I would. I felt hollow, like something essential had been scooped out of me and replaced with silence. I replayed every interaction with Lauren, every word I might have said wrong, every look I might have misinterpreted. I wondered when loving my son became something that could be framed as judgment. And underneath all of that, a quieter, more painful thought began to form. What if this wasn't just about the wedding? What if this was about my place in his life now? The morning after that phone call, I woke up before sunrise, the way I always had when Daniel was young. My body didn't know yet that my role had changed. Habit carried me into the kitchen, where I made coffee strong enough to sting my nose, then sat at the small table by the window and watched the street come alive. Neighbors left for work. A dog barked. Somewhere, a car radio played a love song too loud. The world was moving forward, steady and indifferent, while mine felt like it had been paused mid-breath. I kept thinking there must be some misunderstanding, some explanation that would soften the blow. People don't just erase their mothers, I told myself, not without a reason that makes sense. Around mid-morning, Lauren called. Her voice was gentle, almost rehearsed, like she had practiced sounding calm. She said she hoped I wasn't upset. That sentence alone felt like salt on a wound. I told her I was confused, which was the truest thing I could manage. She explained that the wedding had become overwhelming, that too many opinions were making it hard for her to feel centered. She said she needed the day to be about her and Daniel alone, about their love, without any pressure. When I asked her what pressure I had placed on her, she hesitated. Then she said, "Sometimes it feels like you expect things from us, expectations I can't meet." I asked her what expectations she meant. She mentioned comments I'd made months ago, things like hoping for grandchildren someday, or joking that Daniel had always loved my cooking best. Small things, harmless things, I thought. Things mothers say without realizing they're planting thorns. She said those comments made her feel compared, measured, like she could never quite measure up. I apologized immediately. I told her I never meant to make her feel that way. I told her I would gladly step back, adjust, learn, whatever it took. There was a pause. Then she said, "I know you mean well, but this is what we've decided." When the call ended, the apartment felt smaller. The walls seemed to lean in as if they were listening to my thoughts. I replayed the conversation again and again, searching for a crack where I could slip back into my son's life. Instead, all I found was a hard truth pressing against my chest. Intention doesn't erase impact. Love doesn't guarantee access, and sacrifice doesn't buy immunity from being excluded. The day of the wedding arrived quietly. No phone calls, no updates. I woke up early anyway and dressed in the blue dress I had bought months ago, the one Daniel said made me look elegant. I told myself I would return it later. I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at my reflection, trying to recognize the woman looking back at me. She looked older than I remembered, tired in a way sleep couldn't fix. Around noon, I forced myself to leave the apartment and go for a walk. I didn't want to sit at home imagining vows I wouldn't hear. As I walked past the park, I saw a family taking photos, a bride laughing as her mother adjusted her veil. The sight knocked the air out of my lungs. I turned away quickly, my eyes burning. I wondered if Lauren's mother was there, if she was helping with the dress, if she got to cry happy tears and complain about the music being too loud. I wondered if Daniel thought of me at all that day, or if I had already faded into the background of his new life. That evening, Daniel sent a single text. It said, "We're married. I hope you're okay." I stared at those words for a long time before replying. I typed, "Congratulations," then deleted that. I typed, "I love you," then deleted that too. In the end, I sent a simple heart emoji. It felt safer than words. The weeks that followed were quiet, too quiet. Daniel didn't call like he used to. When I reached out, his replies were polite but brief. Lauren didn't contact me at all. I told myself to give them space. Newlyweds need time, I reasoned. But deep down, a fear took root and began to grow. I feared that the wedding wasn't an isolated moment of exclusion, but a line drawn in permanent ink. One afternoon, an envelope arrived in the mail. It was thick, formal. Inside was a receipt from the venue, marked "Paid in Full." Along with it was a short note from Lauren. She thanked me again for my generosity and said she hoped in time we could all move forward without resentment. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of the pain, just gratitude wrapped around distance. I folded the note carefully and placed it back in the envelope, my hands shaking. I had paid for their beginning, but I was not welcome in it. As the months passed, small truths began to surface, the way they often do when you stop forcing yourself not to look. A mutual acquaintance mentioned that Lauren had been uncomfortable with me from the start, that she felt I was too involved, too present. Another person told me Lauren worried I would overshadow her on the wedding day. These weren't crimes, they were insecurities, but instead of addressing them honestly, they chose the easier path. Remove the source. I started therapy around that time, not because I thought something was wrong with me, but because I needed a place to put the weight I was carrying. In that quiet room, I said things out loud that I had never allowed myself to think. I admitted that my identity had been too tightly wrapped around being needed, that I had confused love with proximity, support with control, presence with entitlement. The therapist didn't excuse what had been done to me, but she helped me see the full picture. Two truths can exist at once, she said. You can be hurt, and you can still learn. The real turning point came 6 months later on a rainy afternoon when Daniel showed up at my door unannounced. He looked thinner, older. The confidence he worn like armor was gone. We sat across from each other at the kitchen table, steam rising from untouched mugs of tea. He told me married life was harder than he expected, that Lauren struggled with anxiety and felt constantly judged even when no one was speaking. He admitted that excluding me from the wedding had been Lauren's idea, but that he had agreed to it because he didn't want to start his marriage with conflict. I listened without interrupting. When he finished, I asked him one question. I asked him if, in protecting his peace, he thought about the cost to mine. He looked down at his hands, the same hands I once held crossing busy streets. He said he hadn't, not really. In that moment, something inside me settled. Not healed, settled. I told him I loved him, that I always would, but that things couldn't go back to the way they were. Boundaries, I said, work both ways. Daniel cried then, not loudly, just quietly, shoulders shaking the way he used to when he was little and didn't want anyone to see. I didn't rush to comfort him. I let him feel it. Some lessons need space to land. When he left, he hugged me tightly and said he hoped we could rebuild. I told him rebuilding takes time, honesty, and respect, not money, not silence. Today, my life looks different than I imagined. I see Daniel occasionally. Lauren and I are polite, distant, careful. I no longer offer more than I'm asked to give. I no longer confuse sacrifice with love. The moral of my story isn't that children owe their parents everything. It's that love without boundaries can quietly teach people how to erase you. After Daniel left that afternoon, the rain kept falling like it had something left to say. I stood by the window for a long time, watching drops race each other down the glass, thinking about how many years I had spent believing love meant endurance, that if I could just last long enough, give enough, forgive enough, everything would settle into its rightful place. But nothing settles on its own. Things either grow or they drift apart quietly while you're busy holding them together by yourself. In the weeks that followed our conversation, I noticed something unfamiliar in myself, a stillness. I wasn't reaching for my phone every time it buzzed, hoping it was Daniel. I wasn't rehearsing apologies I didn't owe. For the first time in my life, I allowed silence to exist without rushing to fill it. That silence taught me things. It showed me how often I had shrunk my own needs to make room for others, how often I had accepted discomfort as the price of belonging. Daniel did try in his way. He called more often, he asked how I was, really how I was, and waited for the answer. But there was a difference now. I didn't perform reassurance for him. I didn't rush to smooth his guilt. I spoke honestly, carefully, but honestly. When something hurt, I said so. When I needed space, I took it. It wasn't punishment, it was self-respect learning how to walk on its own legs. Lauren remained distant. At first, that hurt more than I expected. I had imagined, foolishly, that once the wedding dust settled, we might find common ground. Instead, our interactions stayed formal, almost scripted. I could sense her discomfort around me, the way she measured her words, the way her shoulders stiffened when I spoke. For a while, I took that personally. Then I realized something important. Her discomfort wasn't my responsibility anymore. I could be kind without contorting myself into something smaller. One evening, Daniel invited me to dinner at their place. I hesitated before accepting. Part of me feared reopening wounds that hadn't fully healed, but another part knew avoidance would only deepen the distance. When I arrived, the table was set neatly, the food carefully prepared. Lauren smiled, polite but tense. We talked about safe topics, work, weather, a neighbor's new dog. Beneath it all, a conversation waited, heavy and unspoken. Halfway through the meal, Lauren surprised me. She put her fork down and looked at me directly. Her voice shook slightly as she spoke. She said she wanted to apologize, not for the wedding itself, but for how it was handled. She admitted she had been afraid of losing herself in marriage, afraid of becoming secondary in Daniel's life the way she had watched her own mother do. She said excluding me felt like reclaiming control, even though she now saw how much pain it caused. I listened. I didn't interrupt. When she finished, I thanked her for saying it. I told her I understood fear more than she realized. I told her I never wanted to replace her, only to remain connected to my son. We didn't resolve everything that night. Apologies don't erase history. But something shifted. The air felt lighter, like a window had been cracked open after a long winter. As months turned into a year, my life continued to expand in quiet ways. I took a class I'd always postponed. I traveled alone for the first time, learning that solitude didn't mean loneliness. I built routines that belonged only to me, and in doing so, I discovered a version of myself that had been waiting patiently in the background all along. Daniel and I found a new rhythm, not the constant closeness of childhood, but something more balanced, something that allowed us to meet as adults, not as obligation and sacrifice. When he talked about starting a family someday, I listened without inserting myself into the picture. When he asked for advice, I offered it only when invited. Love, I learned, grows best when it isn't crowded. Sometimes I still think about the wedding day, about the empty chair where I should have been, the dress that stayed in the closet, the vows I never heard. Those memories still sting, but they no longer define me. They are chapters, not the whole story. If there is one thing I hope someone listening takes from my experience, it's this. Being a parent does not mean disappearing so your children can shine. It means standing firmly in who you are, loving without erasing yourself, and trusting that the right relationships will make room for you. I paid for my son's wedding, yes, but the real gift I gave myself was learning that my worth was never meant to be measured by an invitation. Time has a way of revealing what we try hardest not to see. As the second year of Daniel's marriage unfolded, I began noticing patterns that had always been there, quietly shaping my choices long before the wedding ever happened. I saw how often I had stepped in before being asked, how quickly I had offered solutions instead of listening. None of that excused the pain of being excluded, but it helped me understand the full shape of the story, not just the part where I was hurt. I started paying attention to my own reactions instead of just everyone else's needs. When Daniel would cancel plans last minute, I noticed the familiar urge to say it was fine, even when it wasn't. This time, I told him I was disappointed, not angrily, not accusingly, just honestly. He sounded surprised, then thoughtful. He apologized, a real apology, not the rushed kind meant to smooth things over. Moments like that began to stack up, small bricks rebuilding something sturdier than what we'd had before. Lauren and I continued our careful dance. There were no long phone calls or spontaneous visits, but there was respect. On my birthday, she sent a handwritten card. It wasn't long, but it was sincere. She thanked me for raising a son who was patient and kind, and she acknowledged that she was still learning how to share space in a family that already existed before her. I read that card more than once, not because it fixed everything, but because it showed effort, and effort matters. One afternoon, while sorting through old papers, I came across the original wedding budget spreadsheet. My handwriting was all over it, notes in the margins, numbers circled and recalculated. I expected the sight of it to hurt. Instead, it made me strangely calm. I realized that money in this story wasn't the true currency. Power was, control was, fear was. And on my side, love had been given freely, without conditions, but also without limits. That was the imbalance. I decided to do something symbolic for myself. I took the dress I never wore and donated it to a local women's shelter that helped mothers starting over after divorce. As I handed it over, I felt a quiet release. That dress was no longer a reminder of exclusion. It became a small piece of someone else's new beginning. Walking back to my car, I felt lighter than I had in a long time. Daniel called me that evening, unaware of what I'd done. He told me Lauren was pregnant. The words landed gently, not with the sharp joy or fear I might have felt before. I congratulated him, truly. After we hung up, I sat in silence and let myself feel everything at once. Happiness for him, a flicker of sadness for what might be complicated, and a firm resolve to approach this next chapter differently. When the baby arrived months later, I waited to be invited, and when the invitation came, it felt earned, not assumed. I held my grandchild carefully, aware of how fragile trust can be. I didn't make promises about always being there. I simply was there in the moments I was welcomed and fully present when I was. Looking back now, I understand that the wedding wasn't the betrayal itself, it was the mirror. It showed me where I had placed my worth and how easily it could be taken away when it depended on someone else's choices. The real work began after the hurt, in the quiet rebuilding of myself. If you're listening to this and you've given and given until you felt invisible, please hear me. Love should not require self-erasure. Support should not cost your dignity. And boundaries are not walls. They are doors that open both ways when there is mutual respect on the other side. Becoming a grandmother changed something in me that I didn't expect. Not in the loud, sentimental way people talk about, but in a quieter, steadier way. Holding that tiny life in my arms, I realized how many versions of myself had existed before this moment. The young woman who became a mother before she fully understood herself. The exhausted provider who learned to survive without help. The devoted parent who mistook sacrifice for security. And now, the older woman learning how to love without losing herself. At first, I was careful to the point of restraint. I waited for invitations before visiting. I asked before offering advice. I bit my tongue more times than I could count. Part of me feared that one wrong word would send me back to the margins again. Another part of me understood that fear itself was something I needed to outgrow. Relationships built on walking on eggshells aren't healthy either, so I worked on finding a middle ground, present but not intrusive, loving but not overextended. Daniel noticed the change before I said anything. One afternoon, while we sat on the couch watching the baby sleep, he told me I seemed different, calmer, more grounded. I told him I finally was. He nodded like that answer made sense to him in ways he couldn't yet articulate. He admitted that marriage had forced him to confront parts of himself he'd never questioned before. His tendency to avoid conflict, his habit of choosing the path of least resistance. He said excluding me from the wedding felt easier than standing up to Lauren's fears at the time. Hearing that hurt, but it also clarified something important. Avoidance can look like peace on the surface, but it always charges interest later. Lauren and I had our own moment of reckoning not long after. She came over one afternoon while Daniel was at work, the baby asleep in the carrier on her chest. We sat at the kitchen table, the same place where I had once folded wedding receipts with shaking hands. She told me motherhood had humbled her in ways she hadn't anticipated. That fear, the same fear that drove her to push me away, now lived inside her every day. Fear of failing, fear of being judged, fear of losing herself. I listened, not as a rival or an obstacle, but as another woman who had once stood exactly where she was standing. I told her something I hadn't said out loud before. I told her that being excluded from the wedding broke my heart, but losing my sense of self for so many years had broken it long before that. I told her I didn't want to compete for her for Daniel's love. There was room for both of us if we allowed it. She cried quietly then, the way people do when they finally stop defending themselves. That conversation didn't make us close friends, but it made us honest. And honesty, I've learned, is a far sturdier foundation than forced closeness. As time went on, I noticed how differently I showed up in all my relationships. I stopped volunteering to fix everything. I stopped measuring my value by how indispensable I was. Instead, I focused on reciprocity. If effort wasn't met, I stepped back without resentment. That alone changed the energy around me. People responded differently when they realized my presence was intentional, not automatic. Sometimes, late at night, I think about the woman I was when I wrote those wedding checks, how certain I was that generosity would protect me from being pushed aside. I don't judge her anymore. She did the best she could with the understanding she had at the time, but I wish I could sit beside her and whisper what I know now. I would tell her that love doesn't need to be proven through suffering, that being needed is not the same as being valued, and that saying no does not make you selfish, it makes you whole. The story of my son's wedding is no longer just a story of exclusion. It's a story of awakening, of learning that relationships evolve, and sometimes that evolution hurts before it heals. I didn't lose my son, I gained myself, and in doing so, I found a way to love him and everyone else without disappearing in the process. There's a strange freedom that comes with realizing you don't have to be everything to everyone anymore. It doesn't arrive all at once. It slips in quietly, between moments, until one day you notice you're breathing easier. That was how it happened for me. I began to notice the absence of that constant tightness in my chest, the one that used to show up every time I thought I might disappoint someone. I had lived so long in anticipation of other people's reactions that I'd forgotten how it felt to simply exist without bracing myself. With the baby growing quickly, Daniel and Lauren's lives became fuller and more complicated. Sleepless nights, unexpected expenses, disagreements about parenting styles. I watched from a careful distance, offering help when asked and stepping back when not. There were times when every instinct in me wanted to step in, to guide, to correct, to smooth things over. But I reminded myself that this was their life to learn, their mistakes to make. Love didn't mean rescuing anymore. It meant respecting their autonomy, even when it was uncomfortable. One evening, Daniel called me, sounding overwhelmed. The baby had been sick, work was stressful, and he and Lauren had argued over something small that felt enormous in the moment. He asked if I thought he was failing. That question took me by surprise. I realized then how much pressure he carried, how deeply he feared repeating the past. I told him something I wish someone had told me when I was his age. I said, failure isn't falling short of perfection. Failure is refusing to grow. And he was growing, even in the mess of it all. After that conversation, something shifted between us. He stopped coming to me only for reassurance and started coming to me for perspective. There was a difference. Reassurance asks you to take away the pain. Perspective asks you to sit with it. I was finally being invited into his adult world, not as a caretaker, but as a fellow human being. Lauren, too, began to relax around me. She started asking questions, not just about the baby, but about my life, my work, my past. One afternoon, she asked me how I survived raising a child alone. I told her the truth. I said I survived because I didn't know there was another option, and because love, even imperfect love, has a way of carrying you further than you think you can go. She nodded, absorbing that quietly. In that moment, I saw not my daughter-in-law, but a young woman standing at the beginning of a long road, just as uncertain as I was once. Despite these improvements, there were still moments when the old pain resurfaced. Anniversaries have a way of doing that. On the first anniversary of the wedding, I found myself restless and irritable for no clear reason. I snapped at a coworker. I forgot where I put my keys. It wasn't until later that evening that I realized what day it was. The memory came back uninvited, the empty calendar square, the silence, the feeling of being erased. I let myself cry that night, not because I was back where I started, but because healing doesn't mean forgetting. It means remembering without losing yourself in the memory. I didn't tell Daniel or Lauren how that day affected me, not because I was hiding it, but because I didn't need them to carry it for me anymore. That was another lesson I'd learned. Not every pain needs an audience to be valid. Some things are meant to be processed privately, then gently laid to rest. As time went on, I noticed how my relationships outside my family were changing too. Friends treated me differently. They listened more closely. They respected my boundaries. I stopped being the one who always showed up with answers and started being the one who showed up with presence. That shift created deeper connections than I'd ever had before. It turned out people didn't need me to save them, they needed me to see them. One afternoon, while cleaning out a drawer, I found an old birthday card Daniel had made me when he was 8. The paper was creased and faded, the letters uneven. Inside, he had written, "Thank you for always being there even when you're tired." I held that card for a long time. It reminded me that the love between us was always real, even when it became complicated, even when it hurt. Relationships don't disappear because of one terrible decision, but they do change shape, and resisting that change only causes more pain. I realized then that the wedding story I told myself for so long, that I had been discarded, replaced, made irrelevant, was incomplete. The fuller truth was harder and kinder at the same time. I had been hurt by people who were acting out of fear, not malice. I had contributed to patterns without intending to, and I had the power to choose how that story ended. So, I chose to end it with dignity, with boundaries, with love that didn't beg for space but waited to be invited. I chose to end it with growth. If you're listening to this and you're standing in the aftermath of a moment that changed how you see your place in someone's life, I want you to know this: your value was never dependent on their invitation. You don't lose your worth because someone else doesn't know how to hold it. Sometimes the most painful exclusions become the doorways to the fullest versions of ourselves. By the time my grandchild turned 2, the sharp edges of the past had softened into something I could touch without bleeding. Not because time had erased what happened, but because I had finally stopped fighting the reality of it. Acceptance isn't approval. It's simply the decision to stop arguing with what already is. That distinction changed everything for me. I became more intentional about how I spent my days. I retired earlier than I had planned, something I once feared because work had been my safety net, my distraction, my proof of usefulness. Without it, I had to face myself more directly. I filled my time with things that didn't revolve around anyone else's needs. Morning walks, a small book club at the library, volunteering once a week at a community center where no one knew my story and didn't need to. I was just Evelyn there, not someone's mother, not someone's backup plan, just a woman with a voice and a presence of her own. Daniel noticed the change before I said anything. He told me I seemed lighter, like I wasn't carrying the world on my shoulders anymore. I smiled and told him it was because I finally put it down. He laughed, but there was something thoughtful behind it, like he was beginning to understand what that really meant. Lauren, too, began to shift in ways I didn't expect. She stopped bracing when I entered a room. She asked my opinion more often, and when I gave it, she listened instead of defending herself. One afternoon, while watching my grandchild play on the floor, she admitted that she had been afraid of me from the beginning, not because of anything I had done intentionally, but because she saw how deeply Daniel loved me and feared being compared to that bond. Hearing that didn't make me feel powerful. It made me feel sad for her. Love isn't a limited resource. It expands when it's shared, but fear makes it feel scarce. I told her something that surprised us both. I said I didn't need to be central in their lives to feel secure. I only needed honesty and respect. I told her that I trusted her to love my son in her own way, just as I trusted him to build a life that didn't revolve around me. That was the first time I saw her shoulders truly relax in my presence. There were still moments of awkwardness, still boundaries that needed reinforcing, but the tone had changed. It was no longer about exclusion or control. It was about negotiation, about learning how to coexist as adults with separate identities and shared history. That kind of relationship takes work. It takes humility. It takes the willingness to be uncomfortable without turning that discomfort into blame. One day, while flipping through old photos, Daniel found pictures from his childhood and brought them over. We sat together on the couch, laughing at hairstyles and crooked smiles. At one point, he grew quiet. He told me he regretted the way the wedding had been handled, not in the abstract, but specifically. He said he wished he had stood up for me, that he had been afraid of losing Lauren, but in that fear, he hadn't realized he was risking something else just as important. I didn't rush to absolve him. I let the words sit between us, heavy and sincere. Then I told him forgiveness wasn't a moment. It was a practice, one we were both still learning. As he left that evening, I felt something close to peace. Not the kind that comes from everything being perfect, but the kind that comes from knowing you can handle whatever comes next. I no longer needed apologies to validate my pain or inclusion to validate my worth. I had learned how to stand on my own ground. Looking back now, I see the wedding as a turning point, not because it excluded me, but because it forced me to ask questions I had avoided my entire life. Who am I when I'm not needed? What does love look like without sacrifice as its currency? How do I stay connected without losing myself? Those questions didn't have easy answers, but they led me somewhere honest. If there's a lesson in my story, it's this. Love should be chosen, not assumed. Presence should be mutual, not demanded. And sometimes the most painful rejections are invitations in disguise, invitations to reclaim yourself, redefine your boundaries, and rediscover your own voice. I paid for my son's wedding, yes, but what I gained in return was something far more valuable. I gained myself back. Part 8. As the years moved forward, I stopped measuring time by what had been taken from me and started measuring it by what I was building. That shift didn't happen overnight. It came slowly through small choices that added up to something steadier than the life I used to live. I learned to say no without explanation. I learned to sit with discomfort without rushing to fix it. And most importantly, I learned that my role in other people's lives did not determine the size of my own. My relationship with Daniel settled into something quieter, but more honest. We talked less often than we once did, but when we did talk, there was substance. He shared his doubts, his frustrations, his fears about being a good father and a good husband. I shared parts of myself I had never made room for before. My regrets, my dreams that had been postponed indefinitely, the ways motherhood had shaped me, and the ways it had limited me. We were no longer performing roles for each other. We were simply two people connected by love and history, learning how to meet in the middle. Lauren, too, continued to soften, not in a dramatic, sudden way, but in the slow, human way that comes from repeated moments of safety. She began inviting me to small things, birthday dinners, afternoon walks, a school event for the baby. Each invitation felt intentional, not obligatory. I accepted some and declined others, choosing based on my capacity rather than my fear of being left out. That was new for me, and freeing. One afternoon, while we were all sitting together in the living room, Lauren made an offhand comment about how she hoped her child would always feel welcome in her home, no matter what. The words hung in the air longer than she probably intended. Our eyes met briefly, and in that moment there was an unspoken understanding. She knew, I knew, and we both knew we were trying to do better than what had come before. I began speaking about my experience more openly, not to seek validation, but to tell the truth. When friends asked why I didn't attend the wedding, I no longer made excuses. I said simply that I wasn't invited, and that it had been painful, and that I had learned a lot from it. The honesty surprised people. Some were uncomfortable. Others leaned in, relieved to hear a story that reflected their own unspoken wounds. I realized then how many parents carry silent grief about changing relationships with their children, how often that grief is dismissed or minimized. There were moments, of course, when the old ache returned unexpectedly. A comment, a memory, a photograph would catch me off guard. But those moments no longer swallowed me whole. They passed through, leaving behind a gentle reminder of how far I had come. Healing, I learned, doesn't mean the pain disappears. It means it no longer controls the story you tell yourself. One evening, while walking home from the library, I passed a wedding venue decorated with lights and flowers. A younger version of me might have stopped, stared, and felt that familiar tightening in my chest. This time, I smiled softly and kept walking. Not because weddings no longer meant anything to me, but because that particular symbol no longer defined my worth. I had rewritten that meaning for myself. The greatest surprise of all came from within. I began to trust myself in ways I never had before. I trusted my instincts. I trusted my boundaries. I trusted that I could survive disappointment without breaking. That trust changed how I moved through the world. I took chances I would have avoided before. I spoke up when something didn't feel right. I allowed joy without bracing for loss. If someone had told me years ago that being excluded from my son's wedding would lead me here, I wouldn't have believed them. I would have seen only the rejection, only the grief. But life rarely unfolds in straight lines. Sometimes it bends painfully before it opens into something wider than you imagined. I don't regret paying for the wedding. I regret only the years I spent believing that giving more would guarantee my place. Love doesn't work that way. It never has. Love thrives on choice, respect, and mutual care. Anything else is just obligation wearing a kinder face. So if you're listening to this and you're standing on the edge of a moment that makes you feel invisible, please hear me. You are still here. Your story is still unfolding. And sometimes the moment that hurts the most is the one that finally pushes you toward yourself. By the time my grandchild started school, life had settled into a rhythm that felt earned rather than assumed. Mornings were quieter. Evenings belonged to me. I had learned how to enjoy my own company in ways I never thought possible when my days were dictated by someone else's needs. There was a peace in that, a groundedness that didn't depend on anyone else's approval or invitation. Daniel and I talked one afternoon about legacy, not money or property, but the kind of legacy that lingers in how people feel when they think of you. He said becoming a father had made him realize how much pressure he put on himself to get everything right. I told him that no one ever does. What matters is how you repair, how you listen, and how willing you are to grow when you realize you've hurt someone. He nodded slowly, absorbing that. In that moment, I saw him not as the boy I raised or the man who hurt me, but as a person still becoming. Lauren and I had reached something close to mutual respect. We weren't inseparable, and we never would be, but we had found a way to coexist without tension. She trusted me now, not because I had proven my usefulness, but because I no longer tried to insert myself where I wasn't needed. Trust, I learned, often grows when control steps aside. One evening, after a family gathering, Lauren stayed behind to help me clean up. As we washed dishes side by side, she said something that surprised me. She said she admired how I handled everything after the wedding. She admitted she didn't think she would have had the same grace if the situation were reversed. I told her grace wasn't something I woke up with one day. It was something I learned after failing at resentment over and over again. Holding on to anger had only made me smaller. Letting go made room for peace. That night after they left, I sat alone in my living room and thought about how close I had come to letting bitterness define the rest of my life. How easy it would have been to freeze my heart at that moment of rejection and never thaw it again. Many people do, not because they want to, but because they don't know another way to survive the pain. I was grateful I had found a different path, even if it took longer and hurt more than I expected. I began mentoring younger women at the community center around that time. Many of them were mothers navigating complicated family dynamics of their own. They spoke about feeling invisible, unappreciated, taken for granted. As I listened, I heard echoes of my own story in theirs. I didn't offer solutions, I offered understanding. I told them it was okay to love deeply and still protect themselves, that choosing themselves didn't mean abandoning their families. It meant showing up whole instead of hollow. One woman asked me if I ever wished I could go back and do things differently. I thought about that for a long time before answering. I said I wished I had trusted myself sooner. I wished I had known that being a good mother didn't require constant self-sacrifice. But I didn't wish the pain away. Without it, I wouldn't have learned what I know now. Growth often comes wrapped in experiences we would never choose willingly. On the anniversary of the wedding, years later, Daniel called me early in the morning. He said he just wanted to check in. He didn't say much else. That call told me everything I needed to know. The memory no longer sat between us like an accusation. It existed as a shared history we had both survived and learned from. As I hung up the phone, I felt a quiet sense of completion. Not an ending exactly, but a closing of a loop. The story that began with exclusion had moved through pain, reflection, change, and understanding. It had brought me back to myself in a way I never expected. If there is one final truth I want to leave you with, it's this. Your worth is not something anyone else gets to grant or revoke. Not your children, not your partner, not your family. Love is richest when it's given freely, but it must also be protected. You can open your heart without handing over your identity. You can support without disappearing, and you can heal without forgetting who you were before the hurt. I paid for my son's wedding, and I wasn't invited. That was the moment I thought I lost everything. In reality, it was the moment I finally began to find myself. There's a quiet kind of strength that comes from knowing you've already survived the worst version of a story you never wanted to tell. Once you reach that place, fear loses its grip. That's where I found myself in the years that followed, no longer bracing for loss, no longer trying to predict every emotional shift around me. I trusted that whatever came next, I would be able to meet it as myself, not as a version shaped by obligation or guilt. My relationship with my grandchild deepened naturally, without effort or strategy. I was present in the ways that mattered most, listening, noticing, remembering. I learned that children don't need constant gifts or grand gestures. They need steadiness. They need someone who sees them without expectation. In offering that, I felt a quiet joy that had nothing to do with proving my place in the family. It simply existed. Daniel grew into his role as a father in ways that surprised me. He became more reflective, more willing to sit with discomfort instead of avoiding it. One afternoon, while we watched his child play in the yard, he told me he finally understood something about the wedding. He said he realized now that love doesn't grow by removing people, it grows by making space. He said he wished he had known that sooner. I didn't respond right away. Some realizations don't need answers, they need acknowledgement. I nodded, and that was enough. Lauren, too, continued to change. Motherhood had softened her edges, but more than that, it had taught her empathy. She once told me she thought strength meant control. Now she understood it meant trust. Hearing that felt like a quiet closing of a wound I hadn't realized was still open. Not because she owed me those words, but because they showed growth. And growth is the truest form of accountability. I often think about how different this story could have been if I had chosen resentment, if I had withdrawn completely, built walls instead of boundaries, used silence as punishment instead of protection. That path would have been easier in the short term. It would have spared me some uncomfortable conversations, but it would have cost me something far greater, my capacity to love without fear. There were still moments of sadness, of course. Grief doesn't vanish simply because understanding arrives. But the sadness no longer felt sharp. It felt like a gentle reminder of what I valued, not a verdict on my worth. I learned how to carry it without letting it shape my identity. Sometimes people ask me if I'd do it all again, if I'd still pay for my son's wedding knowing how things turned out. My answer surprises them. I say yes, not because the outcome was fair, but because the act itself came from love, and I don't regret loving deeply. What I regret is not the giving, but the belief that giving required me to disappear. That belief was never true. As I grow older, my priorities have become simpler: peace over approval, honesty over harmony, presence over performance. These choices don't make life perfect, but they make it real, and real is something I no longer trade away. If you're listening to this at a moment when you feel sidelined, overlooked, or quietly replaced, I want you to hear this clearly. You are allowed to take up space. You are allowed to change. You are allowed to outgrow roles that no longer honor who you are. Love doesn't demand your silence or your suffering. I paid for my son's wedding, and I wasn't invited. That experience broke something open in me, and in that opening, I found a life that belonged to me again, one shaped not by what I was owed, but by what I chose to become. As I look back now, I see my life less as a series of roles and more as a long, unfolding conversation with myself. For so many years, that conversation was drowned out by responsibility, expectation, and the quiet fear of becoming irrelevant. I thought my value lived in how much I gave, how much I endured, how little I asked for in return. It took one painful exclusion to finally force me to listen to the voice I had ignored for decades. The wedding wasn't the first time I'd been overlooked. It was just the first time I couldn't explain it away. I couldn't soften it, justify it, or pretend it didn't hurt. That rawness stripped me of my usual defenses and left me face to face with a truth I had been avoiding my entire adult life. I didn't know who I was without being needed. And that realization, as terrifying as it was, became the doorway to everything that followed. In the years since, I've learned that motherhood doesn't end when your children grow up. It transforms. The hands-on years give way to something more delicate and, in many ways, more difficult. You have to learn how to love without directing, how to care without controlling, how to stay connected without standing in the center. No one really prepares you for that transition, and when you get it wrong, the consequences can be heartbreaking. But I also learned that mistakes don't disqualify us from healing. They invite us into it. Daniel and I didn't rebuild our relationship by pretending nothing happened. We rebuilt it by telling the truth, sitting with discomfort, and choosing growth over pride. Lauren and I didn't find peace by becoming close friends. We found it by respecting each other's boundaries and acknowledging each other's fears. Not every relationship needs to be intimate to be healthy. Some just need honesty. There is a moment I return to often, especially when I'm tempted to slip back into old patterns. It's a quiet afternoon, my grandchild asleep on the couch beside me, sunlight warming the room. No one needs anything from me in that moment. I'm not fixing, funding, or sacrificing. I'm simply there. And for the first time in my life, that feels like enough. If you take anything from my story, let it be this. Love should not cost you your sense of self. You are allowed to evolve beyond the roles that once defined you. You are allowed to stop proving your worth through exhaustion, and you are allowed to grieve the moments you were excluded from without letting that grief harden your heart. I paid for my son's wedding and I wasn't invited. That sentence once felt like a verdict, like the final proof that I had failed at something essential. Now it feels like a turning point. A painful one, yes, but also the moment I stopped living on the edges of my own life and stepped fully into it. I am still a mother. I am still a grandmother, but I am also a woman who knows her value, who honors her boundaries, and who no longer waits for permission to belong. And that, more than any invitation, is the ending I needed.